What if the oldest human ocean voyage was not in the Mediterranean, not in the Pacific, but on a forgotten continent that no longer exists? What if the world's first true seafarers were not the Greeks or the Vikings, but a people who crossed open oceans 65,000 years ago without maps, without metal, without any sign of land on the horizon? Imagine the supercontinent of Sahul. During the last ice age, sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania became one single landmass, bigger than modern Europe. To the west lay another great island called Sunda, which we now know as Southeast Asia. Between them was a treacherous stretch of deep water that no land bridge could ever close. The Wallace Line, a biogeographical barrier so strong that it separates Asian animals from Australian marsupials to this day. To cross it required intentional open ocean voyaging. For decades, historians assumed this was impossible for ancient humans. They pushed the date of Australia's settlement forward, believing such technology emerged late. The textbook story was clean and simple. The first Australians arrived around 45 to 50,000 years ago, likely by accident, swept along coastlines on rafts they barely controlled. They were not pioneers, they were drifters. But the crack appeared in 2017. A team led by archaeologist Clarkson excavated a rock shelter in Arnhem Land, Northern Australia. Its name is Madjedbebe. The Mitochondrial traditional owners have always known it as sacred ground. Deep beneath the surface, in sediment layers undisturbed for millennia, the team found more than 10,000 artifacts: ground-edged axes, grinding stones, ochre used for ceremonial painting, and the world's oldest known sheets of mica, a reflective mineral that shimmered in firelight. They used optically stimulated illuminescence to date the surrounding sand grains. The results were staggering. The lowest occupation layer was 65,000 years old, give or take 5,000 years. This pushed human arrival in Australia back by up to 18,000 years earlier than most scientists had believed. The academic world erupted. Some rejected the date, others cautiously accepted it. But archaeology alone could not settle the debate. For that, science needed genetics. The genetic smoking gun arrived in November 2025. A major international collaboration led by the University of Huddersfield and the University of Southampton published a groundbreaking study in the journal Science Advances. The team analyzed almost 2,500 mitochondrial DNA genomes, maternal lineages passed from mother to child, unchanged for thousands of generations. These samples came from Aboriginal Australians, New Guineans, and people across island Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. By applying a refined molecular clock and cross-checking their results with known Pacific colonization events, the researchers arrived at a clear conclusion. The most ancient genetic lineages found only in Aboriginal Australians, only in New Guineans, or in both but nowhere else on Earth, dated back to roughly 60,000 years ago. The old genetic estimates, which had placed arrival between 47,000 and 51,000 years, had underestimated the timeline. The new data aligned almost perfectly with the 65,000-year-old artifacts at Madjedbebe. For the first time, genetics and archaeology agreed. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians reached Sahul around 60,000 to 65,000 years ago. This is the paradigm shift. The old story presented the colonization of Sahul as a single event, one group arriving in one wave. The new data reveals something far more complex. The mitochondrial lineages split into two distinct clusters. One traced back to northern Indonesia and the Philippines, the other traced to southern Indonesia, Malaysia, and Indochina. Both date to roughly the same time, roughly 60,000 years ago. That means there were at least two separate groups of settlers, arriving via two different routes from two different homelands in Southeast Asia. They did not come by accident, they came by design. Each sea crossing required crossing the Wallace Line, a deep water barrier where no island chain ever connects. This was not drifting on a log, this was deliberate navigation. The first Australians were not latecomers to the human story. They were among the most advanced voyagers of the ancient world. They crossed oceans thousands of years before anyone else even tried. And that leads to the ghost population. The ancestors who made that voyage are no longer alive. Their mitochondrial lineages have disappeared everywhere except within the indigenous people of Sahul. That means these ancient voyagers did not leave descendants in Southeast Asia. They simply left. They sailed into the unknown, found the new world, and never looked back. Their sisters, their cousins, their extended families who stayed behind in Indonesia or the Philippines have no living trace. A whole population wiped from memory, preserved only in the DNA of Aboriginal Australians and New Guineans. They were there, but history never recorded them. The genetic data also reveals profound isolation. After the initial settlement, the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians remained almost completely cut off from the rest of the world for over 50,000 years. There was no gene flow from India, no admixture from Europe, no contact from Asia until very recent times. That isolation produced something remarkable. They are, quite literally, the most genetically distinct people on the planet. Not diverse in the way that all humans are diverse in a deeper sense. Genetically, the difference between an Aboriginal person from Arnhem Land and an Aboriginal person from the Central Desert can be greater than the difference between a European and an East Asian. And this diversity is not recent, it is ancient. It accumulated during those long millennia of isolation, as different bands adapted to different environments, rainforests, deserts, coastlines, islands, all while remaining one people, one culture, one continuous heritage. This forces an uncomfortable question. Who were the real pioneers of human history? The civilizations that left stone pyramids and written records? Or the peoples who crossed oceans without leaving a single word? Only their bones and their blood. The technology that revealed this is itself a modern miracle. Next-generation sequencing reads degraded DNA from teeth, from bones, from ancient sediment. The Huddersfield team used mitochondrial genomes as time machines, counting mutations like tree rings to track ancestry back through the Ice Age. They also analyze Y chromosome data and genome-wide markers, cross-checking every result against archaeological and climatological models. The convergence was undeniable. The molecular clock, once considered too unreliable for deep time, was recalibrated using well-dated Pacific colonization events, creating a level of precision that had never existed before. The ghost population finally had a name, a date, and a story. History remembers names. It sings the praises of Polynesian voyagers crossing the Pacific. But those achievements came later, thousands of years later. The first ocean crossing, the one that changed everything, happened in the waters between Sunda and Sahul, carried by people whose names we will never know. They left no writing, no monuments, no cities, but they left their DNA. And that DNA tells a story more remarkable than any epic poem. When the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians landed on the shores of Sahul, they stood on a continent with no human competition. The megafauna, giant kangaroos, marsupial lions, wombats the size of rhinos, had never seen a primate. The land was fresh, empty, waiting. And the people who claimed it did so with nothing but bamboo rafts, deep knowledge of the stars, and an impossible courage. So, here is the final mystery. Why did they leave? Why would anyone paddle beyond the horizon to a place they couldn't see? The answer is lost, but the DNA suggests they were not refugees fleeing disaster. Their genetic diversity is too high, their founding population too large. They were explorers, deliberate, skilled, fearless. They traveled not because they had to, but because they could. And in doing so, they became the first voyagers, the first Australians, and one of the oldest continuous cultures on the planet. History remembers names. DNA remembers people. Subscribe to Genealogy X because the past isn't gone. It's hidden in your DNA.